Hey, tonight we're talking about anger and patience, which is a good start because how many of you were with us last week? We talked about gluttony and temperance, which are two words that usually we don't even know what the definitions are. So it's just like a good place to start, like we recognize both of these words. So there's just going to be a simple anger questionnaire. We're going to figure out who's the angriest person in the room, and that's how we'll start. But in all seriousness, this is where I think we should start with anger. How many of you experience, or let's do past tense because it's easier as Christians to admit it. How many of you have experienced in the distant past anger before? Okay, so I did some digging. I'm not an expert, I'm not a psychologist, but it turns out in basically every theory of core human emotions, some people say there's 5 core emotions, some say 4, some say 7 or 8. In every single list, what emotion do you think appears? Anger. So some of the other ones are happiness, sadness, fear, shame, anger, and I think disgust is a common one. So what it means that these are core emotions is these are things that we can't completely control. Like something happens and we react with anger. How many of you have experienced reacting in anger? If you flip the page, you can see a bar graph charting road rage incidents in LA County, if you wanted to know. Some of you might be part of those statistics. Here's the idea. Anger, and I want you to hear this right up front, anger done from the flesh is called sin. In this whole series, we are not shying away from calling sin what it is. We are taking a page right out of the Bible and saying, hey, if we just call sin what it is, we recognize how pervasive and big of a deal it is, then we can do 2 things. We can recognize how deeply we need the grace of Jesus, and we can recognize how deeply we have to be dependent on him every single day. So we're going to talk about anger. Before we do, I read these 2 quotes today, and I thought both of these needed to be in the outline. The first one came from Aristotle. Anybody ever heard the name Aristotle? Aristotle was almost exactly 1,700, like if he was alive today, he'd be like 1,700 years old, which is very old. But he wrote this 1,700 years ago. Anyone can become angry. That is easy. How many of you want to say amen? However, to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, that requires wisdom. Amen to that. It turns out, and we'll talk about this in just a second, that the Bible does not explicitly say that anger in and of itself is sinful. What it says is anger that is rooted in our flesh, in our sinful desire, is sinful. How many of you know that the Bible has so many examples of saying that God became angry? How many of you know that as a theological cornerstone, we believe that God doesn't sin? Okay, so there's something about anger that if done correctly is actually maybe a virtue and not a vice. Here's the second quote. This is a Chinese proverb I read this morning. You cannot see your own reflection in boiling water. Why might that be a quotation talking about anger? What happens when you get angry? You lose control, you get fired up, you get hot, right? The proverb is that when you become angry, when the water is boiling, so to speak, you are not able to see your reflection. You're not able to see yourself in the correct light of how you really are. So how many of you know that when you become angry, your judgment becomes very clouded? How many of you can honestly say, maybe you have kids, I have said and done things that I regretted almost immediately after doing or saying them? Yeah. So this is what it's about. This is a perfect segue because it turns out that in Hebrew, the word for anger is a really easy one to pronounce. It's just pronounced af, like this. And it literally means nose or nostril. But it's translated as anger. Anybody want to guess why? What happens when somebody gets really enraged and angry? Their nostrils start to flare. Isn't that such a cool way of understanding anger? Right, so it's this core emotion that starts to well up in you. I've been thinking all week as I've prepared of the pressure cooker. How many of you got a pressure cooker? And when you go to release the pressure, you can release it at different speeds or different valve. I don't know what I'm trying to say. I am not an engineer. I don't know if you knew that. It's the pressure builds up and the nostrils start to flare. It's the emotion inside that's about to explode into something negative that we call anger. And we're going to talk about this in a moment too, that so often when we say the word anger, what we're really talking about is the physical things that we do in our anger. We yell, slam doors, whatever it might be for you or for others. But the Bible talks about anger primarily starting as an emotion that leads into those behaviors. In Greek, the word it means to be provoked to anger, to be angry, to have opposition, or to be enraged towards something. I tossed this in there. This is from the Helps Word Study. And you can see the footnote down there if you're interested in just doing word studies and learning more. You can check out that resource. It says this, that this word, this anger, is positive when it is inspired by God, but it is always negative when it arises from our flesh. So, sinful or unnecessary anger focuses on punishing the offender rather than the moral content of the offense. So what does that mean? That means when anger is done against you, the sinful fleshly thing is to do what? To lash out, to get even, to get back at them. Some people might say the best way to do it is just to give them a black eye. Some people might be like, I'm going to go backdoor route and I'm going to undermine them and demean them behind their back. But this is what the flesh does in its anger. So what would it mean to focus on the moral content of the offense? This would be righteous anger. What would righteous anger be? Okay, it's a good example. That's pretty fresh on my mind. Yeah, the reaction. It's the recognition. Sal has wronged me. Do I like what he's done to me? Am I a doormat? No. But do I recognize that it is a sinful thing in him that's doing that to me? That is not God's desire for our relationship. And so you see past the simple behavior and the desire to react, and you see this is a moral failing that's rooted in sin. The reason I act out in anger from my flesh, the reason others do so, is something greater. And so our anger is not directed at individuals, it's directed at sin in the world. Making sense so far? Okay, so let's talk about some actual actions, not just kind of like philosophical. I wrote in here, righteous versus unrighteous anger. When anger is informed by the ways of God, it is morally good, says the Bible. When it is informed by our own flesh, it is corrupted and evil. Corrupted means anger that's rooted in self-interest. What can I get out of this? Maybe it's just manipulating a relationship so that I have the upper hand and the leverage to do something next. These are all ways that anger can be corrupted. So let's talk about outward anger and inner or passive anger is a better way to describe that. How many of you know what outward anger is? What's outward anger? Yelling, that's outward. What else? Physical, like a fight. I wrote down a few other things. This is the losing your temper, breaking things, fighting, verbal altercations, name calling, honking that horn, using that middle digit on the freeway. Those are all outward signs of anger. Okay, we're on the same page. Now, these are usually what we think of when we're talking about anger. We usually immediately jump to these sorts of things as these are people with anger problems. How many of you would agree that someone who cuts you off, flips you off, and honks their horn at you probably has an anger problem? Yeah. I like that we use the third person and you don't say, I've done that before. I read the stats. At least one person in this room has done this. I just pray that it was pre-Jesus. So what is passive anger? Now this is interesting because passive anger is not always associated with anger, but it is more subtle, more sly, maybe under the radar. So internal or passive anger comes out in degrading others. Maybe I'm angry with somebody, and so in the social circle, I'll just very slyly try to demean or undermine them behind their back. This is, you know the difference when somebody's being sarcastic and it's funny, and then you realize there's something loaded going on here. Maybe you've been the third party of two people who are sarcastically going at it, and you're like, I don't know what's going on, but this is personal, and I can tell, right? That is passive anger. This is interesting. I read this term, stacking the deck to prove a point. And I'm going to give you an example of that in a second. Giving people the silent treatment on purpose out of anger. These are all maybe not behaviors that you immediately think of as anger, but they are rooted in anger. So let's talk about how passive anger and outward anger, how they kind of collide. I was watching a sermon from a guy who was preaching in North Carolina. And I think North Carolina is a good place, so I just trust everything this guy said. So I want to tell you all about it. I need a sip really quick. But research bears something interesting out I forgot to mention. It's that men and women experience very similar levels of anger. How many of you are surprised to learn that? A little surprised to learn that. Now, the reason I was surprised to learn that is because until I started doing some study, I always thought of outward anger as true anger. If you had to guess, who is most likely to act out anger outwardly? Men. Who's most likely, just think of like the stereotypical movie character, who's most likely to get upset and like punch the side door of a car? It's a male character, right? But when you understand the root of anger and you realize women also carry anger, it comes out more passive. So this guy was telling a story of a couple that he had counseled like 20 years ago. And he basically said, this is the scene that they wanted to work through. He said, husband comes home from a long day at work. All those husbands can nod their head. Oh yeah, I know where this is going. Walks in, and the house is a mess. So he says the thing that he's definitely not supposed to say, which is what? What have you been doing all day? Why is this place such a disaster? Because that's not triggering at all, is it? No. So there's some dishes in the sink, and man, the kids went to bed an hour and a half ago. How come this place isn't spotless and squeaky, right? What kind of anger is this? This is the beginning seed of outward anger, right? So the passive anger is the passive-aggressive comment, which is, well, it wouldn't be so dirty if someone helped out around here, right? Okay, you see where this is going, right? Then a verbal altercation ensues. Husband raises his voice, feels like he said all he has to say, walks out and slams the door. Outward aggression, right? There's the outward anger. He says the wife's reaction is pretty simple. It's to collect all the dishes in the house and just pile them all up in the sink and leave a note that you can come to bed when these are done. See how that works? That's how this works, and that's an extreme example, but this guy is kind of showing the point. This is how anger kind of comes back and forth, how it plays off itself, how it grows, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, how many of you would be surprised to find out that anger is maybe the core emotion, but something that grows out of anger are things like resentment grows out of anger, right? Resentment grows out of anger and hurt kind of combined and feeling like nothing is ever going to be right, and it's my job to kind of stick it to somebody because they don't live up to my expectations. So let's talk about what anger does. Unchecked anger leads to hate and vengeance and wrath. I read this, the more dug in someone is in their anger, the more likely that they self-justify their own anger. So what does that mean? That means that now we have a feedback loop of anger. And my anger is justified. And the more justified my anger is, the more angry I become. Round and round and round. And so what does this look like in real time with real people? How many of you would be surprised to know that the most angry people are also the people who have the hardest time apologizing? Is that interesting? Why is that? Because in your self-righteousness, in your self-righteous anger, you have a hard time assigning any blame or fault to who? Yourself. And if none of the blame or the fault falls on you, then what do you have to apologize for? Right? Is this making sense to everyone? So what does this do, let's just say, to a relationship with a spouse? Oppressor-oppressed relationship. I haven't thought that through, but it makes perfect sense on the surface to me, yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, it creates real damage, and not just real damage, it's damage that's just compounding on itself. I can't remember, I'll flip ahead just because I think it makes sense. Let's see. 1 in 5 people report, 1 in 5 adults report that a serious relationship ended because of anger issues. 1 in 5. This is where it starts, right? So this is what anger does. Anger breeds other things. I wrote down a list that I read. Vindictiveness. This is, I take pleasure in someone I am angry at getting what they deserve. Okay? Resentment, contempt, revenge, unforgiveness. Now I want to talk about the final thing that I think is the biblical spiritual component of this. What does anger do spiritually? I would say that the core problem of anger is it dehumanizes other people. It begins to wear on your ability to see other people created in the image of God, right? If I'm self-righteous in my anger and I'm angry with you, you are less of a human. Now, people might not say that, but over time, what anger does is it begins to wear out your ability to see others as made in the image of God. Let me give you one warning that I think I heard this week that I thought, ooh, I need to write this down for myself and hopefully to share with you. Sometimes I think that we buy into these large-scale narratives that we should be really skeptical of. And we should be really skeptical of, as Christians, of news stories or big events in our country or our neighborhoods or our world where people are bulked together and a label is slapped upon them. Okay? I don't want to go here, but I think this is just a good example. So let's just say you belong to a certain political party. The other party is usually in your mind not thought of as individuals, but a group. Does that make sense? Now, do groups of people, the group itself, bear the image of God? No. Do individuals? Yes. So if we bulk people together and slap a label on them, are they easier to dehumanize? Is it easier to point and say, my anger is righteous directed towards you, plural, group of people? Yeah? Is it harder for that same person who's pointing the finger at a group of people to sit across the table from an individual that maybe is from that group and still say the same exact things? Yes. Why is that? Because even if you don't 100% know God or know the things of God, there is something innate in us that sees value in other human life. It takes a lot of sin and a lot of brokenness to not see humans in the image of God, or at least valuable. Are you following with me? Which is why in just a second, Jesus is going to He's going to conflate anger with what's the most dehumanizing thing possible? Murder. He's going to take the two and put them together. We'll see that in a second. Okay, let's pause for a second. Any questions? Okay, cool. Let's talk about our culture and anger. These are just kind of 3 or 4 of my observations. I think the culture has some things about anger correct and some things wrong. Does that sound familiar? It's not all or nothing. So I have a question for you. You get in trouble. Let's say you're road raging. You get arrested. Nobody's hurt. You're not getting locked up for it, but you're getting sent to anger management. Okay. What does that tell you about how the world views anger? What's that? Okay, it's a problem, but it's a problem to be managed. Okay, how many of you think that it's a problem to be managed? Okay, kind of, sort of. I think this gets it right in this sense, that it recognizes that anger is a human emotion that is not just going to go away. The Bible doesn't even say that somehow as you follow Jesus, anger just disappears. So this recognizes this is not anger elimination, but I would say a more Christian word would be anger submission. Because I think the Bible tells us that this is not our problem to manage on our own. This is our problem to submit to God and to submit to his plan for how we deal with anger. And here's kind of the spoiler. I think that God wants to use your anger and he wants to redirect it into righteous causes that are righteously passionate for injustice in the world, that want to make a difference for the kingdom. That anger redirected towards sinful behavior and propped up by people who are following Jesus are people who actually get stuff done for the kingdom. And so I think anger submitted to God is anger that God can take and reshape and redirect towards something righteous. Here's a couple other thoughts about anger in our culture. It turns out that anger is, and again, this is just things that I was reading online. By the way, when I say I read this online, I'm reading like legitimate articles. I hope you know I'm not just like on Wikipedia or like on teenage blog sites. I'm not. It turns out that anger is the emotion that is most likely to be suppressed. 2 P's or 1? Okay. Grew up with a Microsoft Word account, so it's just going to fix it for me. So you just get close and it'll do it. I'm a terrible speller because of that. Okay, so this is an emotion that is suppressed, and it's very suppressed often. So what happens when you suppress an emotion? It comes out in crazy ways, right? I would say some of us are really good at suppressing. Some of us are really bad at suppressing. And there are pros and cons to both, right? If you're really bad at suppressing anger, what would be a pro to that? Yeah, you vent easily, so therefore you're not just carrying around your anger because you just let it out all the time. What would be the con? Huh? Illness? What was that, Mike? Having to listen to it. Or like, man, his anger just comes out all the time. He's angry about everything, right? Clear con. What would be the pro to suppressing it really well? You could fake people out. You could like be in normal social situations and get by, right? What would be the con? When it comes out, what's going to happen? It's going to be an explosion. Anybody ever been around somebody, a coworker or something, where the explosion happens and you're like, I know that something just triggered it, but the trigger seemed really small for that reaction. And in your maturity, you realize there was probably a lot of pent-up pressure going on there, and whatever was just said was just what released all of it, right? This is how anger manages and kind of begins to take hold of our lives. The third observation I have that I was reading about is something I already mentioned, but it's that anger is primarily, and this is a stereotype that I think is wrong, but this is how the world sees it, is primarily a masculine emotion. As we've defined, this is not true. I'm just telling you kind of what I think the culture communicates to people. So think about what's a good avenue for our culture. Think about movies, right? This is kind of the artistic expression of our time for what our culture believes to be true. Who are the most angry characters? The Hulk. Yeah, there you go. The Hulk. That's actually a good example. Okay, so I think there's 2 ways of understanding masculine anger. And I think this actually plays into some of the confusion of how do you deal with anger? What should you do with it? The first one I would say is there is this character type. It's the bearded lumberjack who's angry and mad, but like he gets stuff done, kind of gruff, right? Usually not a main character role, but a secondary character role, right? So it's presented as it's like very tough, masculine, and yeah, anger just comes with the package. Everyone following? So this is the, I'm just going to call this the lumberjack. That's how I'm picturing. It's like full beard, not like those designer hipster boots, but like real working boots with steel toes, a real axe, all of that. Lumberjack. Honestly, what I was just thinking, anyone, what's the beef jerky commercial where the guy like beats up the bear? Do you remember talking about? What is it? Do you know what I'm talking about? Nobody. Okay. You know it? Basically, the bear steals the dude's beef jerky, and he's like not having it. He gets angry, and he beats up the bear for the beef jerky. And then the thing is like, oh, that good or something. Okay, now there's the other masculine anger, and this is where we get the idea of kind of like toxic. This is why men are always the problem. Anybody ever heard this narrative before? Which one is right? Neither. Yeah, neither. How many of you are on team neither? How many of you are on team neither? Okay, so neither are correct. Neither. Okay, the last just observation that I think is a really important one. I was praying a couple days ago, and I feel like this was just something heavy on me as I was trying to write it out and figure out what the thought was. But how many of you are 100% aware that there is something called righteous anger? Tell me something that you should be righteously angry about. Just blurt out a couple things. What kind of injustice? Name it. Yeah, child trafficking. How many of you would say righteous anger? Yeah, absolutely. Anything else? Hate crime. Absolutely. Righteous anger, right? Okay, so we know what righteous anger is, but I think this is the thought I have. There is not, it is not justified in your righteous anger to react unrighteously. Does that make sense? So sometimes what happens is you are righteously angry about something, and in your righteous anger, you lash out towards a political party or a movement, and you put them on full blast. And so your righteous anger is about this sinful thing, but then you want to punish people who maybe could potentially be part of the solution. Does that make sense? And so often what happens in anger is I think the way that anger can take something good and twist it is to say, okay, we've come to an agreement, hopefully, that there's certain things to be righteously angry about, but in our response to it, then we start to get angry with each other instead of say, let's keep our eyes on the prize of what deserves our righteous anger, and let's figure out how to solve it together. How many of you know that infighting happens like this all the time? So sometimes we have this righteous anger, and whether it's political or whatever, we get upset at the people instead of including them. And hey, we have this in agreement. Let's tackle this issue together. This is my last observation. I think you'll understand this. How many of you know that the culture says I just erased it. I'm just going to say RA. The culture says there are things to be righteously angry about also. Right? What are some of the things that maybe the culture would say we should be righteously angry about? Actually, I'm not going to put you on the spot. I'll just tell you my thoughts. How many of you know that we're living in a very polarized world right now? And if you're not familiar what polarized is, just think like politically, there are more or less two factions of people that are getting further and further apart, and very few people who are willing to straddle the middle line publicly. Although statistics actually say most people find themselves in the middle anyways. The culture says, if you want to be part of us, you can be righteously angry at them. Does that make sense? And so your righteous anger has to be pointed towards the correct political group, issue, individual, systems, structures. And if you do, then it's just going to be this feedback loop of, yeah, you're angry about the right things. I think we need to be careful of recognizing the difference between what the culture says we're to be righteously angry about and what God's word says. And I would say a good start would be God will always be righteously angry at anything that dehumanizes and doesn't recognize his image in other human beings. That's always a great place to start. So if the culture is saying you can be righteously angry at that person because they have the wrong political beliefs, you should be able to say, wait a second. I'm allowed to disagree and not be angry, right? Because I recognize God made that person. And I bet if we sat down, we could find things that we had in common and build a friendship and a relationship. So let's talk about road rage in Los Angeles. This is actually part of a few statistics. Of you getting canceled? I understand for sure.
Somebody wants you to join their movement, you go, well, I don't really believe in it, or I don't want to publicly say I support it.
Yeah. Yeah, how many of you are familiar with cancel culture? Yeah. I'm pretty familiar with it. I am a pastor at a church. I've had lots of friends basically say, like, in certain mixed company friend groups, you're not invited. That's just kind of how it goes. It's too awkward for people, right? I understand, and I understand there's a lot. There's a huge cost of cancel culture. Would you agree? I also think that when you stand for what God stands for, if people want to cancel you, that is a cost that followers of Jesus should be willing to pay. It's just, I think, as we bear out our discipleship to Jesus, we should be willing to say, if you want to eliminate me from certain company, you want to talk down about whatever it might be, I will not back down from my faith and my convictions and my beliefs. And my beliefs are even people who might see themselves as my enemy, I see them as made in God's image. And I will always hold out hope that in a relational setting that we could find common ground and I could speak into you the love of Jesus. So let's talk about anger and how it impacts people's lives. We talked a little bit about men versus women. Women are more capable at suppressing anger in the moment. How many of you would nod and say, that's true? But they're also more likely to act out their anger through manipulative social interactions. So men more likely to get in a fist fight, women more likely to use their anger to manipulate social settings. 64% of people say that the world is becoming an angrier place. This is like kind of funny, but my honest first reaction is like, what's wrong with the other 36% of people, or where do they live? Roughly 1 in 5 people say they've had a serious relationship end because of an anger issue. 12% of people report having difficulty controlling their anger to the point of physically lashing out. 32% of people say they have a close friend or family member that is often unable to control their anger. 9% of American adults, so this is 22 million people, have a documented history of impulsive and or excessive angry behavior. These are people who have been pulled over for road rage, for instance, or been booked in a jail or prison for a crime that's related to anger. Maybe you've been written up at work or assigned to go to anger management. 9%. Pretty wild. Yeah? So I put this chart here. I'd say if that's the real statistics, which it is, that includes probably some folks in this room, but by the grace of God, you're not bound by that. But I would say there's a reason why this graph keeps going up and up. And if you're wondering about 2020, that's when nobody was driving during lockdowns. So, anybody want to comment on road rage? Did you just whistle at your husband?
No, he's always on the road. No, I've never seen him rage out at anyone, but I'm sure they've raged at him and they won't mix their truck.
I have a story in my own home where somebody followed my wife very aggressively for about 10 minutes. The police were on the phone and were giving her directions to come to the police station. They were doing hand gestures that were very violent and terrible. And when she got to the police station, the car drove off as fast as they could when they realized. So pretty scary stuff. But here is the discussion question. We'll kind of keep this one relatively short. Describe a time when your anger led to an outcome that harmed you and or others. So I would encourage you, this is like week 6 now, you know some people. Be honest, be open. I think sometimes honesty breeds honesty. The more open you're like, here's a real example, more people are like, well, if you're going to share, then I'll share as well. So we'll take 4 or 5 minutes. We'll keep it relatively brief. Talk about a time when anger did not end well for you or others. So this is what I want to do. I want to jump into a scripture. I wish we had time to just go all in for an hour, but we don't. If you'd like to, we actually studied Matthew for, how long did we do Matthew? I think 60 weeks or something, right? So if you want to hear somebody's hot take on Matthew chapter 5, you can look on YouTube. And by hot take, I mean probably not hot at all. It is what it is. There's only so many things you can say about the Sermon on the Mount that haven't already been said. I had a professor in seminary say, if you have something new to add to something like the Sermon on the Mount, you're probably wrong, which is like, oh, that's good. It's like just kind of an ambition killer of like, if you're trying to find something no one's ever seen, and the 10 Commandments or the Sermon on the Mount, you're probably out in left field. But Matthew chapter 5 comes right in the middle of the greatest sermon ever preached. This is the Sermon on the Mount. And I want to just point out a couple things about it because I think it has something to tell us, not just about anger, but what God thinks about anger. And when I'm saying anger, we're talking about anger that's rooted in the flesh. This is sinful anger. So Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment.'" This is him talking about the divine judgment. How many of you would say murder is bad? Okay, everybody is in agreement. "But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment." What did Jesus just say? The result of murder and the result of anger are the same. How many of you would say, whoa, that's kind of a curveball? Now, he's talking about the divine judgment. How many of you know that in the eyes of God, sin is sin? How many of you also know that on earth, the consequences for sins vary? If you mass murder someone, your consequences are different than getting angry or even road raging. We all understand that to be true, right? But what Jesus is saying is that the sin of murder will come before the seat of judgment the same as the sin of anger. You will be liable to the judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, "You fool," will be liable to the hell of fire. This word fool is kind of a hard word, but it means basically idiot. It means somebody who has thoughts that aren't even like intelligible. That's how I think of you. That's what this word means. Will be liable to the hellfire. So what is Jesus saying? He's saying that there is something deep that these people have understood, and it's this, that your outward actions matter. How many of you would say your outward actions matter? So much so that right embedded in the 10 Commandments is, "Thou shalt not murder." Right? Okay, so we're all on the same page. This is bad. Everybody knows it's bad. Ancient Jews knew it was bad. The Jews that Jesus is speaking to know it's bad. And Jesus says, here's a hot take for you. The emotion that begins anger, that begins to grow out until its ultimate form is murder, is also sinful in the eyes of God. What does that do to the idea of self-righteousness, by the way? How many of you could live your whole life, you are so self-controlled, you could go 90 years without ever murdering? Pretty good, right? You guys are good. How many of you guys could go a whole lifetime without getting angry? 0. I didn't realize I'm usually not funny, but thanks, Debbie. Oh, it's Mike. Mike's funny, yeah.
I just said that I want to officially say this is before the retreat.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I don't need a lot of sleep, by the way, on the retreat. I'm not a big duration sleeper, but I'm a hard sleeper, and if you mess with it, you might see a side of me you've never seen before, just so you know. So here's the idea. What Jesus is doing in the Sermon on the Mount, he's trying to explode the idea that you could self-righteously earn your way to heaven by having really good behavior. He's trying to let them know that the pervasive nature of sin is so bad that it starts in your thought life, your heart life, and that's where your actions grow out of. So you might be able to hold down anger in your heart to the point where you never kill anyone, but in the eyes of God, they're both sinful and you're both liable to judgment. So if you cannot earn your own eternal life, what does that do to you? It makes you dependent on the grace of God entirely, completely, all the time. This goes all the way back to week number 1. Sin is way worse than we think. And when we recognize how bad it is, we recognize we are helpless to do this on our own. Are we all on the same page? That's what Jesus is saying. Your behavior cannot earn you there. He goes on. So if you are offering your gift at the altar, what is offering a gift at the altar in this context? It's worship. If you're worshiping God and there, get your pen or your pencil ready, you remember that your brother has something against you. You notice that? Not, I'm coming into worship, oh man, I'm holding a grudge against somebody, I better go make it right. It's, I have a totally clear conscience, but I know someone else has a problem with me. In our culture, what do we say? If you have a problem with me, you should come talk to me about it, right? We say that. That is not what this is saying. This is saying, you got a problem with me, I'll come to you. I don't know why I'm looking at you. I have no problem with you, Greg. That's like very emphatic, looking at Greg. He says, leave your gift at the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. What he's saying is, in humility, recognize that someone has to take the first step. And as somebody who wants to worship God, you recognize he already took the first step towards you. Therefore, to be like him is to take the first step towards someone who wronged you. Did Jesus wrong anyone? No. All the wrong was a one-way street towards him. And what did he do? He stepped towards them, right? So much so that we know he died on the cross to bear the wrath and the sins of the world. So Jesus says that's what you do. You go in your humility and you say, hey, look, I recognize that maybe there's something off here. Maybe I did something that I'm not aware of, but I want to make it right. How many of you have ever been approached in real pure humility before? How many of you know it's very hard to maintain anger when you just deep in your sense know that the person speaking to me is full humility? Anybody? How many of you have ever felt totally wronged before and someone came to you and they owned it completely and totally in a total posture of, I am so sorry. I recognize how badly I hurt you. How many of you have had that experience before? Very few of you? Wow. It is almost impossible to maintain the stronghold of anger in that situation when you recognize that someone is willing to do that. So Jesus says that's what you should do. And then he used this kind of hyperbolic language to prove the point. And he says this, come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are going with him to the court. What is the court he's talking about? In our life, we're on our way to the divine judgment. Lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly, I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. I was reading the commentary either this morning or yesterday morning, and the author was saying this, that anger at its root, when it grows out, will lead some of you to prison. That's what it says. You'll be put in prison. But anger, when it grows into its fullest form, even if you don't land behind actual bars, you will be held in a prison called the prison of anger, where every relationship, every dynamic is seen through the eyes of angry. I'm not getting what I deserve. They're getting more than they deserve. There's jealousy, there's envy, there's strife. There's all of these things packaged in. I think we're going to move on, but there's a question there that I'd encourage you to answer in your own time. Okay, how many of you are ready for a 180, not 9? How many of you are ready to turn 90 degrees? Let's do a 180, and let's go towards patience. How many of you love patience? How many of you know that patience comes from a Latin word that literally means to suffer? Amen. In Greek, the word that we get in the New Testament for patience means perseverance, to suffer, long in duration, and to be patient. I read this in the Help study this week. It says, properly long-tempered, which means to defer your anger, to refuse to retaliate, to not react from human reasoning. Christian patience is the opposite of anger, because it allows God to shape our emotional response through time, space, reflection, and reordering of our understanding. This is what patience is. It's God reorder me to understand and see the world in the way that you do. And when you do that, you begin to see what God is angry about and what God is not angry about. You begin to see who has a grudge against me that I want to go make it right in humility before I worship as a display of Jesus came to me, right? So let's talk about the world's view of patience, and then I want to get to something really cool, which is called solitude. How does the world view patience? I came up with this word, that patience is transactional in our culture. How many of you would say there are certain moments where our culture values patience? How many of you would say, if I had preschool children, I would want to drop them off with teachers who are going to be patient with them? You know? Like, every time a 5-year-old hits another kid, I don't want like a letter home that your kid is a terrible human being and is going to prison, because it turns out they're just going to hit each other a lot. Are you on the same page with me? Okay, so there's something about patience that we admire, but let's just root it in ourselves. So often I am willing to be, if I'm honest, I'm willing to be patient with someone if there's something in it for me. How many of you would agree that you've been there before, right? So maybe you're at work and there's a new person hired and you're like, oh man, training another person. But what's in it for you? When you get them up to speed, your workload will be less. How many of you are like, well, if my workload is less in the long run, then I'm willing to be patient? Yeah. So I think there is sometimes when patience is seen as a virtue, especially I would say for children or for kids or for people that we agree need people's patience. I would say, our culture would say patience is great relationally, but it's a liability in a lot of areas in the world, right? So somebody has a bill due to your company on a contract that has a date stamped and signed on it, and they haven't signed. How many of you would be like, I'm going to show them a little patience? Yeah, take your time, right? So there's an element of like, maybe it's not always valued. Emphasis on you needing patience for others, right? How many of you have prayed this prayer? Can you please pray for me? I need patience for this guy at work. He's so annoying. Anybody have a version of that prayer? How many of you have ever asked for prayer like this? Please pray for my buddy at work. He has to put up with me and I'm a total pain in the butt. Very few, right? So what's the point? The point is we are more apt to see patience as something we need for all the annoying, terrible people in our life, but very often we have blinders on to see that there's probably people who think that of us. Interesting take. Okay, so let's talk about insights into patience. I learned this week. What's interesting is in social psychology, there's lots of studies about these traits, but patience is not a really studied field. And I read that the main reason is that patience is really difficult to measure. So how do you say like, hey, you score really high in patience? It's not really narrowed down how you measure that in people. So a lot of the studies are anecdotal and observational, but I think they ring true to us in some terms. So here, let's read some of this. The highest predictor of long-term relational and financial success in the world is the ability to what? Delay gratification. What does this mean? Anybody see the really cute kids experiments with like marshmallows or cookies? You know what I'm talking about? It's you have a 5-year-old, you put them in a chair, you put a big marshmallow right in front of them, and you tell them, you can eat that marshmallow. Or, I'm going to go in the other room and fold some laundry, and when I come back, if the marshmallow is still there, you can have another marshmallow, right? I don't know the stats. Have you guys seen these experiments? Go on YouTube. They're really cute, right? And then you get the kid who's like biting their nails for the first time. They're like, don't do it, don't do it. Then they like nibble, and then they hide the nibble, like maybe she won't know. Very funny, okay? But these are early delay of gratification. Some of the other experiments are tracking teenagers who get their very first job and tracking how quickly it takes them to spend their paycheck. It's kind of interesting, right? Who is able to save and save and save and delay and delay and delay and buy a car? Who is, at least when I was a kid, you would get your paycheck and you would run off to Circuit City to buy CDs, right? And it was like a status symbol. You remember those big fat leather binders with 4 CDs on every page? And it was like, whoa, you have that many CDs, right? So delaying gratification, being able to say, like, I'm going to wait. But delaying gratification is linked to, ready for this? Patience, assertiveness, self-control, and positive self-image. Is it any wonder to anyone that something the Bible said 2,000 years ago, as people study it, comes out to be true even in the secular world? That people with literally an element of the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, are successful in relationships in the world? It's no mystery to me. Individuals with high scores in patience also report higher levels of satisfaction in their relationships and work environment. I put this in the footnote because I loved it so much. The working hypothesis is this, that patient people do not see themselves as a finished product. I am a work in progress. I'm willing to be patient with myself as I put in the work. Therefore, I don't expect my friendships and maybe my spouse to be a finished product either. I'm willing to be patient because we're both in this together. We're both growing. Isn't that kind of a cool way to see it? Those with high patience experience work burnout at a much lower rate. Some suggest only 25% of those compared with low patience. Interesting. Now, but yeah, I think it's also for burnout, it's willingness to say, you know what? There are seasons of life. Seasons come and seasons go, and I'm willing to put in the hard work when things are not going well because I know how to delay gratification, and I'm going to see this through, right? How many of you know someone who's the opposite? That's like the second something gets hard, I'm out. Yeah. I always thought of this in youth ministry as like the middle school dating scene. Like, he said he didn't like Taylor Swift, so I had no choice. We broke it off right then and there on the telephone, right? Or via text message or whatever they do now. I don't know. There's no patience. Oh, interesting. I didn't read that, but I can kind of see that on first blush, yeah. I think there's various types of anxieties, but I think some of them probably, yeah. Yeah, I could see that in a lot of situations, yeah. Okay, I want to talk about this. This is super cool, and I want to set it up this way. I want to talk about solitude. How many of you are familiar with solitude? You've read about solitude, you know about solitude. Anyone? Okay, I cannot recommend this book enough to you. I think at some point I've gifted it to basically everyone on the staff over the years. It's a little book. It's by an author named Henry Nouwen. Does anyone know Henry Nouwen? This little book is not his most famous book. If you type in his name, you'll go through pages and pages of Amazon until you find it. It's called Out of Solitude. I feel like this book should be on everyone's shelf. It's like a little 50-page book. I don't even think it has a copyright. You could probably get it for like $5 or $6. The author is Henry Nouwen. And so here's the deal about solitude. And we're going to read a chunk of scripture and then talk about a spiritual practice. A long time ago. Yeah, N-O-U-W-E-N, and the first name is like the French would say Henri, H-E-N-R-I, yeah. So not long after the Christian church was birthed, people started to connect some dots on spiritual practices and what happened in them as they participated in the practice. So let me tell you about solitude. For almost 2,000 years, and we actually know from literature that survived from like the 300s, there were already Christian monks who have made the connection, and they call it a divine mystery, that there is something deeply connected that when you pursue solitude in your life, that one of the first things that everyone starts to notice is that their patience grows. Now, this is the interesting thing, is that throughout the centuries, all sorts of people have tried to figure out an explanation as to why, and there's a reason it's called a divine mystery. It's that we don't entirely know why. We just know that when we do that, patience seems to just blossom and grow out of us. So let's talk about solitude. Solitude is a discipline. It's something you just do. How many of you knew that sometimes disciplines are not things that you feel like doing or you want to do? Would you agree? Yeah. Fasting, for instance, right? I don't always want to do it. I recognize that there is a spiritual benefit to fasting. Turns out there's physical benefits too, but I haven't convinced myself to pursue those. Solitude is a discipline that consciously and intentionally pulls away from everything. I would just say it's this. It's quieting your entire life to have no distractions, nothing pushing in on you so that you can just be with the Lord. In some weird sense, this is not even a call to prayer necessarily. I would say there's often an element in solitude that's just like kind of opening up in a prayer. But a lot of it is just, I just want to intentionally sit. In my own life, I would say this is how it works for me. I get up often around like 4:45 in the morning, and I just go for a long walk. And how many of you know your own thought life pretty well? You just know this is how I think. This is how I connect dots. I feel like the way God speaks to me is I'm very aware of how I think, and all of a sudden I will just have a thought that I'm like, that doesn't fit the pattern. Anybody ever have this happen before? Like a person, like I haven't thought of that person forever. I'm outside looking like in Laguna Canyon. Why on earth would I think of that person? Oh, I'm going to reach out to that person. You know, not always, but a lot of times people will say, oh my gosh, you couldn't have reached out to me at a better time. Not me, that's God speaking to me because I recognize that's not a thought that I would naturally have. Solitude is just eliminating all the distractions and setting aside time to be with God. I'd say there's something about simplicity. It's something about pursuing clarity and focus on God's voice in my life. I want to hear you speak. This is not a guarantee that if you set aside 10 minutes of quiet, God's just going to start downloading a novel into you. Not that at all. It is a discipline. So let's talk about Mark chapter 1, and then we'll talk about the discipline. By the way, Mark chapter 1 is what this book is all about. Anybody ever read this book before? You have? It's incredible. Just one of these authors that takes one or two sentences and packs in like what most people would take like 20 pages to write, which is probably not good for book sales because he kept releasing like these 40-page, they're more pamphlets than books, but I don't think he cared. And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he, this is Jesus, departed and went out to a desolate place. This word desolate place gets translated elsewhere as the desert place or literally the solitude place. And there he prayed. I just feel like there should be a couple blank pages in the Bible after that verse because he's just out there in solitude, quiet, praying. And Simon and those who were with him searched for him, and they found him, and they said to him, everyone is looking for you. And he said to them, then let us go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also. For that is why I came out. And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. Just briefly talk about Jesus' life in this moment. I think sometimes we forget to humanize Jesus and recognize the amount of just day-to-day stress he's under. So how about some of the things that he's experiencing? He is in a constant demand on his time, constant demand on his divinity, on his wisdom, on his presence, on his leadership, all day, nonstop, every day. People are hungry. He's coming face to face with the brokenness of sin, illnesses, demon possession, broken relationships, all day, every day, nonstop, around the clock. How many of you feel like I could tolerate that for a day? Now, here's a serious question. Just think about it for a minute. Let's say you had that for one single day. 10 p.m. rolls around and your bed is now open to you. What are most of you going to do? Get in. Yeah, me too. How many of you are going to get in, but then intentionally not sleep the whole night because you're going to go pursue? I think what Jesus is pursuing is a deep type of rest that sleep cannot give you. What does he do? He gets up while it's still dark. He sneaks out of the house, and where does he go? into the middle of nowhere, out into the desert. And what does he do? Just connects to the heart of the Father. Nouwen makes this observation that when Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will, but yours be done. How many of you have prayed that prayer before? That is not a reactionary prayer that you just get yourself into temptation and difficulty and then you pray it and God sprinkles some magic dust and pulls you out. That is a prayer that is prayed out of a place of shaping over time, of knowing what God's will is, being able to hear it and listen for it. And it starts in times when nobody is watching, where he gets up and he goes out to pray, to connect to the heart of the Father. The patience comes in this way, because the disciples wake up and they immediately panic. Why? Because they recognize we can't do all this stuff for let alone a day. We could never do this without him. So what do? We got to go find him. Search party. Party of 12. We need to go find the missing piece, right? So they go out and find him, and you can almost read the panic. Everyone is looking for you. Maybe there's people already knocking on the door. We haven't even finished breakfast. Maybe he'll be back by breakfast. Nope. They're pounding on the door. Where is he? We need him. We need him. We need him. So they got to come find him. And what does he say? Let me finish. I'm not done with my prayer meeting yet. Leave me alone. What does he say? Okay. I'm ready. Why is he ready? Because this is his spiritual rhythm of his life. Mark just tells us one time. Mark tells us right in chapter 1 that this is what Jesus does. He wants you to know right at the beginning, as he's developing an image of who Jesus is, that this is what Jesus does. And when the crowds come, he's ready for them. Why? He's already connected to the heart of the Father. He already has God's heart for them. He already, even in his human frailty, has submitted it all to God and is living God's will out in real life. So they come to him in panic, and he says, I'm ready. Let's go to the next town where I can preach the gospel. That is why I have come, to preach the good news. So this is what I want to do. You can flip to the last page. This is the spiritual practice of solitude. Just so you know, you could look this up. You could just type in like spiritual practice of solitude, and you could get way more information in this. This is just kind of an invitation to try something new. Maybe it's not new to you. Maybe it's like, this is awesome. I'm glad. Maybe I could talk about my experiences with others too. Maybe you're like, I've never tried this before. It just seems like a little too simple and straightforward. How is this a spiritual practice? I promise. So here's my encouragement to you. Solitude should be done alone. If you're like, honey, let's go to the beach, that's a perfect time. Just say, hey, for 30, 45 minutes, I'm going to go find a quiet place all by myself. Just know that I'm going to leave my phone behind. I'm not like drowning in the ocean or lost or anything. I'm just going to go seek out my own time. So just so you know, completely alone. I put some suggestions in there. Maybe you're just at a place where you're like, I'm just going to set my alarm early. I'm just going to sit out under the stars in my backyard. Maybe you're going to go for a walk. Maybe you'll go down to the beach and watch the sunset. I think anything that can kind of elicit the creation of God, for me, has always been helpful. Even just like watching leaves on a tree blow in the wind has been like a good quality thing. Sometimes I know people who are like, in solitude, for me to quiet my thoughts even a little bit, I need my eyes closed. Maybe that's for you. I would encourage you not to do it in bed then, because that will lead to another practice. So here's my encouragement. I would pick 3 times this week. I would pick 2 times, just 20 or 30 minutes. 20 or 30 minutes, no phone, no distractions. Find a quiet place where you're not going to be pushed in on. There's not going to be questions that need to be answered, nothing like that. And let people know I'm scheduling it in. Honey, I'm waking up at 5:30 tomorrow morning, and I'm going to just drive over to this park and sit on a bench. Just so you know, that's where I'll be, and this is when I'll be home. Good. And then I would encourage you to pick one time to try doing it for an hour. That seems like a short period of time. How many of you have ever timed yourself praying, just out of curiosity? I did this as an exercise once, and I was like, I surely just prayed for 30 minutes minimum. And it was like 7. It was like, wow. So an hour might seem like, oh, it's just 1 hour. That's a long time, but it's a long time on purpose. So why do this? The whole point is to just reset your rhythm of your life. So where do I draw my life from? Do I draw it from extra sleep? Do I draw it, like we talked about last week, from food? Or do I draw it from the presence of God? And it's just saying, God, I want intimacy with you. So here's, I've just put some ideas. This is not all-inclusive or anything like that, but this is just to get you started. I would just start by really simply just saying, like, God, I'm out here trying this in all honesty because I want to hear your voice. And if there's something you want to show me or do in me, I'm open to it. And then just quietly be. Just quietly. Feel free. I think this is always a temptation of mine when I think of doing solitude. How many of you are doers? You like to get stuff done. I always have this problem. This is legitimate, where I start thinking, now I'm off on this tangent. My mind is like elsewhere. I would say, let your mind go where your mind goes. And when you recognize that, wait a second, my thoughts are taking me way off, just say, God, I just am right back to my thoughts on you. I just recognize it and I just move on, right back on you. If you want to speak to me, I'm listening. And then 5 minutes later, if you're like, man, I wonder who's going to win the NBA championship this year. Don't be hard on yourself. Just, God, I recognize it. I'm right back on you. God, it turns out, can handle your thought life. That's what I'm trying to say. I would just ask that if God would reveal himself to you, that it would be something that makes sense to you. I put some things that have happened to me. I would say, any thought that pops into your mind that you think, that's totally random, might not be totally random. Any thought that pops in your mind that you're like, well, that's out of nowhere. I haven't thought about that person forever. Consider shooting that person a text message and just see. Or it can sometimes clearly be like, I don't even think in that pattern. I don't connect dots like that. That's really strange. Those are often things that God wants to speak to you on. So I would just, if you have that, just pause and say, like, cool. God, if you want to speak more into that, I'm listening and I'm thinking about that now. Feel free, if you're someone who can open your eyes and kind of just marvel at what God's created. Hear birds, or one of my favorite things is as the sun rises, hearing all the birds in the life just come to. Just recognize the beauty of what God has created. And then I would say as you kind of re-enter life, maybe you're going into making breakfast or getting ready for work, just take some deep breaths and say, like, God, if there's anything that happened that you want me to take with me into my day, reveal that to me, and I will. Maybe it's grace for somebody who needs grace. Maybe it's strength or willingness to do something to take a burden off someone else. So here's a couple things I think you might experience. If you read online, I'm sure a lot of people will say this. You might experience wandering and very disconnected thoughts. How many of you know that between screens and work and assignments and traffic, we rarely, if ever, pause to really think about where your thoughts go? Almost never. I think I told this to Ricardo. One of the only times I ever have that is 2 weeks in the summer every year where I just go fly fishing in Idaho. The first couple days I stand there and I'm like freaked out. Like, what is happening? What's going on in my mind? Oh, I'm just thinking. That's weird. I don't have like something to do. I don't have somewhere to go. That's really odd. It seems strange, but like that's what happens in our pattern. So your mind, you might just think like, whoa, this is what I think all the time, and be alarmed, and that's okay. You might experience difficulty not letting your thoughts just jump around and go crazy. That's okay too. You might experience a deep sense of rest and contentment, just not having a screen in your face, not having something to do. You might experience it as like just deep body rest. That would be awesome. And you might sense that God is speaking to you. I would encourage you to do it all 3 times. Don't get down on yourself. You're like, man, I was out there for 30 minutes. I don't feel like God said anything to me. It's a discipline. It's a discipline. And then I would encourage you to write down anything that you thought of that you thought was odd or strange or out of nowhere, a name, and just start praying into those things and see what God will do. So I'm encouraged. If you do this a couple days and you feel like God has done something cool, I'd love to hear about it. Don't hesitate to shoot me a text. But I'd like to pray, and then we're going to dismiss from here. God, thank you. Thank you that in your word you've left us really tangible things that we can do, that you want to shape us, that you want us to know you and you want us to be fully known by you. So God, I just pray that in the coming week that maybe in just the busyness of life, we would pause and make a conscious choice just to say, you know what, I'm gonna slip out of the busyness, even just for a few minutes early in the morning or in the evening. And God, I really want to pursue hearing your voice. So God, would you calm all the things that or just chatter about us and confusion and distractions. And I just pray for clarity. I pray for those who would be bold enough to give solitude a try. I pray that you would speak to them. I pray that there would be beautiful stories of things that bring joy and laughter and wholeness into people's lives. And God, I pray that right smack in the middle of the week that you would launch us into Thursday, that we would finish strong. We would be people who bear your image, and we tell others the good news that they do too. So would you give us every opportunity to be lights and witnesses to your wonderful grace in the worlds that we live. Amen.